you can get bogged down in the minutia. And I think that's where like being so disciplined about like, we want to make them feel like special and that they are like our only client or only company we're supporting. Doesn't matter if someone's asking about like, how do I add my partner to benefits or relocating someone from the UK to be our CTO of a company. All of that needs to be, attended to with the same attention, and making someone feel like their problem is a very important problem, even if it might not be in kind of the whole grand scheme of what I'm working on.
You're listening to Talent Therapy. Here, you'll find discussions with biotech and pharma leaders around talent and recruiting trends, market insights, and leadership philosophies so that you and your team are informed around an array of industry perspectives. And now, your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Kori Ram, welcome back to the Talent Therapy Podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great, Chris. Good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. We had you on a couple of years ago. We had a really nice conversation when this podcast was first launched. Since then, I'm sure a lot has happened with you personally. I'm sure a lot has happened with you from a business perspective. I feel the audience would like a nice kind of reintroduction of you and your background and what you are doing at 4:59 and 5 a.m.
Just to reintroduce myself, I'm Kori. I've been in life sciences for my entire career, actually. Came up as a recruiter originally, so talent and recruiting are kind of the forefront for me in terms of HR. Had the privilege of working in pharma for several years at Novartis across pretty much every therapeutic group, which was super fun, and I learned so much there. And joined Relay Therapeutics as a biotech. My first one as, very early employee, preclinical, super kind of scrappy at the time, and got to see a ton of company building, just great front and center. And then been at 5 a.m. nearly 5 years now, which is just incredible. I can't believe it to say that. I started off just being completely portfolio company facing and joining what Chris mentioned is our, 459 initiative. So providing a whole platform of support for all the early stage entrepreneurs and startup folks. And then recently took on some HR responsibility for 5 a.m. in the firm. So that's also been a great learning for me since I hadn't really done HR in this environment. But overall, it's been a great journey. I love this job and I love this team. I always tell folks there's been an endless runway of learning, which is what keeps me here, and excited to share and just catch up with you today, Chris.
Awesome. That's a great recap of your background. And sometimes I forget how much experience you have before you got to 5 a.m. in Relay. I think of you as being at 5 a.m. in Relay, and then I forget you had a whole life before that set a pretty strong foundation.
Yeah, I think I left off some roles to not date myself too much too.
That's fine. That's fine. So you've seen all different aspects of talent acquisition and now more HR. And earlier in your career, you really were recruiting centric, and you've kind of progressed from working at drug development companies themselves into a VC where you're not only bringing in talent, but you're also responsible for building the company. And so that's, I can imagine, somewhat of a transition. And so I would love, and I think the audience would love to know a little bit about what you've learned about building companies and what you've learned about venture creation and how that varies from being a recruiting centric only person when you're bringing talent for a drug development company.
Starting with HR and talent, obviously recruiting for a biotech or a pharma, you kind of understand the brand and kind of, the strategy of the company. But the thing that's really, I think, opened up the aperture for me is just understanding, when it comes to finding and shaping new companies, just being exposed to the venture side. And, I have kind of several sets of colleagues. I've got 5 a.m. folks, which are obviously a lot of investment and scientists folks, and then we have our operators within the companies. But I've learned a ton about, what it takes to finding a new, idea and what's compelling. For example, when we think about, what's in advance that's really going to open up a field to reach our goal at 5 a.m. of impacting patients, these advances can be technology. Maybe that's a new delivery modality for genetic medicines that allows therapeutics. It could be biological, so perhaps it's a new target and a pathway, validation of a known target, or even regulatory. So perhaps, the FDA approves a new biomarker that gives us higher confidence that we can achieve approval, in venture timelines. So there's lots of different ways that we can be thinking about new companies. But overall, what I've learned is we rely really heavily on mechanistic or genetic support. And so relying on strong scientific foundations and fundamentals and just getting experience on, how does 5 a.m. and the team think about exciting ideas. So that's been, I guess super exciting for me just as a, starting off as a recruiter and talent HR person as well. I think the other thing I've learned is we also think about like, what is the product going to be? And having that mindset and working backwards. So thinking about what experiments are needed to de-risk the science along the way, what resources and teammates are required to generate the data, and what are the timelines that we need to get there. So there's a lot of talking to clinicians, pharma, and mid to large size biotechs to ensure that we're building something that will be really impactful to patient communities. So I think there's a ton of work I've learned upfront the investment team does to think about the feasibility and that this company is going to have legs. So, when it comes to supporting those teams, we start to generate kind of bottoms up budgets, to think and fund, to the value inflection points. We work really closely if we're partnering with an entrepreneur and the founding teams understand key scientific hurdles. And then that's where, our team comes and we roll up our sleeves and help them really operate and drive the company. So I think that's been just a great learning, overall coming from just, filling roles like in my very early days to now having this broader business acumen and exposed to the venture world.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You started to talk about this, and I do believe you answered this, but maybe you want to add some more to it. So when you're on the investment side, when you're on the VC side, it sounds as though there is almost an end in mind, right? You have a use case, you have a particular need in the market, and then you maybe work backwards and figure out how to address that particular need. And so when it comes to evaluating that, and it comes to, um, putting seed rounds in place, what would you say like the evaluation process looks like? Obviously, you're looking at things broadly, but from your perspective, from a talent perspective, from a people perspective, what would you say kind of goes into that evaluation process?
Yeah, at the larger like level, just like what's going to be compelling, we start with this baseline of, the whole investment team and all folks here at 5am, they're trained scientists or, physicians and are really, following the fields and science deeply, strongly networked. So again, we feel quite immersed in understanding like what's going to be compelling. The team is constantly reading the latest literature. We do an internal journal club. I would really say the 459 team is kind of like this think tank almost, where, they're attending conferences, they're kind of totally just immersed in some key scientific areas, that the team is interested in. So when those come along, we feel like we really have the conviction and understand, what's going to be compelling. So from a, pitch perspective, spending so much time getting smart on some certain areas is one. That's how we help identify. And then when it comes to funding the company, to your point, we always do a seed round. That's a huge part of our strategy. We want to de-risk as much as we can. And we want to be able to really put together a strategic plan for 12 to 18 months to see if, we can create those killer experiments, generate data package, and ideally build that, Series A company that we would want to be investing in as well.
All right. So you have an idea, you have a platform, you have a technology in mind, and then it comes down to differentiating beyond just the technology, right? So like, what would you say from your perspective, what sets portfolio companies and leaders apart beyond just the technology and the data when raising? Or maybe it is really focused on the data and technology, but what would you say there would be from your perspective kind of a key differentiator? I know you've mentioned you're well networked and you have a market of individuals that you're aware of, but I'd be curious.
Yeah, there's so many different ways. I think, once you have that baseline scientific idea, like that we're super smart on, we feel like this is it, we're ready to invest or at least build a seed company around it within the 459 initiative. It really comes down, it's like kind of ironic, but we're on a people podcast, but it comes down to the talent and the people. And so you can have the best, scientific idea, but if you don't build the right operational like executive team and have the right folks and just that right mix of talent and people to help execute, that idea, it really is the people I think that can make or break it, and what we found is being incredibly intentional about how we set up that founding team. And whether it's, just generally understanding, all right, what type of experience do they have? Have they built a company before? If not, then we're going to make sure we surround them with other leaders that have done this before. There's so many different lenses that you can look at, when putting together, that initial founding team. But I think we're just, again, really looking to build, folks that are going to, mesh well together, can really challenge each other, have a great depth of EQ and self-awareness. That's something that we interview for, no matter what level of the company it's going to be. Because if you're not able to really reflect on yourself and be able to kind of give and receive feedback, I mean, it's just going to be not a high performing team. So those are things that we take really seriously when we're interviewing and building out the companies, and something I'm proud of, that we look across the portfolio. We have some really solid teams. And I think, again, the science is going to be the science, but having what can help, to your point, maybe up the ante or really, make that more probably being successful, is having the right people on the team.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk about that process a little bit, because I can imagine that there's some really interesting dynamics that come into play when you are building the company and when you are identifying talent and when you are kind of putting a structure in place. And so you have a technology. In general, there's probably some sort of scientific founder behind that technology, but then you want to build a company around that particular platform, idea, or technology. Who comes first, right? And maybe who comes second? And maybe there's some interesting dynamics to that, but you have a founder, and maybe that founder wants to be the CEO or the CSO, but maybe they don't. And so maybe there's an example you can provide without giving any confidential information away on like how that building actually comes. So like who comes first, who comes second, who sets the vision, what types of delineation is there between a founder and or an executive, if any at all, when it comes to some of these really small seed stage companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the general answer I have is, the thing I'm proud of actually is with our approach and how we build companies is we're able to support multiple different, phenotypes or versions of that. So what I mean is it could be that the founder wants to be part of the company and that is the best decision. Then we are happy to help, build the team around them. So again, have they operated before? What are kind of their strengths? What are the ways that we can kind of bolster them up and create the right team? A lot of the time, I will say most founders, because we're dealing with either folks that are maybe academics or, the science is coming out of, university, those folks can't join. But what we love to do is be as interactive and collaborative as possible and have them be involved. And that's been actually incredibly fun and really exciting for, if we're not having the founder join, but they are involved, maybe they'll be on the board, maybe they'll be kind of in an advisory capacity. It's really amazing to have the operating team be able to interact with that, individual or team where the science is being originated from. They just get so electrified by being able to have, conversations with them, having them even, we had a company that just, opened their first lab space and having, one of those folks join and kind of see that. So I think that's been the nice thing, is that we're very flexible. And again, just obviously if it's the right choice for that founder, whether they join the company or not, and helping them think through like what is going to be the best way. The other thing I'll say is sometimes it's not the right move for them to join and maybe they think it is. And so we can help have those conversations with them and, really talk about like, because that has been, something that we've been through. And ultimately, one company, we had the person just be involved in a different capacity, and it ended up being the right choice for so many reasons, especially that person. So I think, again, we've been through this so many times before. We're able to really help them go eyes wide open into, what does it mean to join a company? Is this going to be the right move? If not, how can we have you be involved in this, really precious idea that you've worked on that's going to be hopefully so impactful and make you feel comfortable with the team that's going to be carrying this through?
I was going to ask you about that. That was one of the first things as you were speaking that I was thinking about is you have a founder who, has this proprietary IP, this proprietary technology, and then in a way they're forfeiting it potentially or giving it up to another group of individuals to really develop it and bring it to ideally commercialization or bring it to the market, whatever the product may be. And I was going to ask you what types of rifts have happened, because I can imagine that some are probably fine with like letting go of it, but some probably really want to stay attached to it. And maybe that's not the best move for the company, because maybe that person is best suited in a genius discovery type capacity versus a developing, running a company capacity. And I can imagine that maybe there's some difficult conversations that you as the investment group or as the backers have to have. How involved do you get in those conversations? Or is that more board conversations? Or is it really a collaboration between the board and the investors? I'd be curious about that, because I imagine that comes up often.
I mean, I don't have any wild like Apple Steve Jobs-esque stories, and I'm really proud of that, because I think to the point is, we try and get ahead of this. Like we're privileged to work with a lot of folks within the 5 a.m. team and all the other, VCs that we syndicate with, where we kind of, have seen this story before, as you mentioned. And so how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So like I mentioned, we have had conversations where, maybe someone is involved, but like, is it time for them to step down? And it's not, one and done conversation. It's a series of conversations. And to your point, especially when someone is so deeply, involved, and it really is, an extension of them and their work. So I think we approach it with compassion. We approach it with, meeting them where they are and knowing that it might not be, something that they decide today, but we will help get them there. And we also know how to get them comfortable if someone is going to have to roll off, with what that can look like, and whether it's bringing in another executive, having them be involved in that search. So I think, to your point, I definitely get involved. It's almost like this advisor role where, all of our partners and investment team, and they are acting board members, are incredibly experienced. But what I like is that they'll pull me in as a thought partner to kind of, how can we frame this conversation? What are you hearing? Because at the same time, I do support some of these executives and have relations. So how do we help jointly together, support folks? But I would say, that's really I haven't seen something as, that dramatic happen, thank goodness. But what I love is that, we've approached things with compassion, with humanity. And, when you do that, I feel like obviously it's a lot easier to help someone move along if that's what they need to. You mentioned kind of like obviously giving up the idea. I mean, the economics and things are all incentivized for folks at the end of the day. So ultimately, if you're a founder and you're going to be maybe completely stepping away or just slightly involved, obviously being having the IP and kind of those types of things, and having, long-term incentives aligned for them. So there is, obviously maybe they're not executing, but I think again, having solace, and we've got a solid operating team. You are literally invested in, a different way, with equity in the company. All the incentives end up ultimately being aligned. So I think that makes it a lot easier for someone to, kind of move on. And especially when they get to interact with the team that's going to be taking their science forward.
Yeah, I'm sure that feels a lot better, right? You still have a stake in the company. You still have some involvement. Yeah. Very cool. And that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. All right. So let's shift gears a little bit, but I think this is really related to really what we were just speaking about, is 459 and what 459 does and how they support early portfolio companies. Because I think having that support at that early stage is critical. And if there's individuals that know how to support startup companies, I think that's going to be really advantageous as to having a startup company with really no support behind it, because that can go in probably a lot of different directions. So I think the audience would like to hear a little bit more about 459 and how 459 supports early stage portfolio companies and startups.
Yeah. And I think, everyone might have been coming from like a company or a pharma, and like you have an idea of what it's like. But what we're talking about is like seed stage. So literally like creating the incorporation docs, like, setting up your bank accounts, like just to be really scrappy and tactical. So it is much, much earlier, even running the trademark when you ultimately name the company and want the logo, and what is that logo even going to be? So this is like total blank slate. So 459 is our company creation platform within 5am Ventures, where we will stand up a company around a technology or insight. It also could be standing up an independent entity around an asset or a group of assets being spun out of a pharma. So I've learned a lot, not just how to build a platform company, which is what I had done when I was an operator, but also all these different ways. Maybe it's a single asset, maybe it's a build to buy, any kind of scenarios that I've been a part of over the last several years. And so that's what we do, for at least maybe a few companies a year is kind of how we've earmarked it. And then often these advances are, happening in academia. The teams don't necessarily operate companies, as you've kind of mentioned. There are many things to do. And so, like I said, incorporating the entity, writing a research plan, hiring a team. I mean, most academics, if you know anything about recruiting, it's a much more long-winded process. There's a lot of, I think time that goes into it. Recruiting in industry is so much more quick. And so, you could lose out on a candidate if you don't, call them back within a day. So I think just helping sometimes, teach folks that have been steeped in maybe academic recruiting, which of course has cycles, it has a deadline, there's a much longer cadence. That's just one example of oh my gosh, there's a totally different rhythm of if you want this principal scientist, they're going to have competing offers. So I think those are just some of the things. Getting lab space, buying equipment. So we literally do all of these things. We set up all of the IT, the email accounts, all of these different things is what the 459 team, it's myself and a few other individuals. But we provide all of that as soon as someone wants to build a company with us and we've deployed capital.
So that's really broadened your skill set and experience outside of talent and HR. It incorporates HR, obviously, and it incorporates talent, but it sounds as though there's a pretty big operational component and maybe even a compliance type component, maybe a slight legal component. How involved, are you really involved in all of those little operational pieces, or are you just kind of having on the outside, making sure they happen? Are you actually kind of on the ground floor doing some of those things that you just mentioned?
It's a combination, and it really is a team effort. We have a couple other individuals on the operations side that are just indispensable, whether they help do things that I'm either responsible for overseeing or we partner together. I also have a legal colleague and who helps, again, kind of on the compliance and legal side. But we are a very nimble team. There's only a few of us, and we work on multiple companies. The thing is that we do things, I'd say, at a boutique scale. So it's really that high touch approach. You aren't getting someone who's just kind of trying to get up to speed every time you call them up. We sit on the executive team or leadership teams. We'll go on site, with the companies, or even if I have West Coast companies, I'll make a point to visit and understand, the site, the teams, build relations. So what you get is this extension and kind of G&A team that when a company is a seed stage, you don't need a head of people. You can't hire you don't need a GC. And if you're relying on outside counsel, you're running up the legal bills. So what we do provide is folks like myself, senior corporate counsel, an operations manager who's this total Swiss Army knife that can do everything from, troubleshooting your Zoom account to planning a holiday party to, help provision a laptop. So again, we do a lot of stuff, and it really is, I'd say, a team effort to get that done. And to your point, sometimes I am in the weeds, doing those things. Other days I'm running a search for a CSO and trying to source a very specific skill set. And I love that. And I think that's the thing that's cool about the job is that, you still have that startup mentality where, I might go empty the dishwasher if I'm on site at one of the startups. I also might be trying to close the CEO tomorrow. So the kind of breadth and variety, and that's just something I personally have always thrived on, is getting to do such a diverse amount of things.
I was going to say, I'm kind of jealous of that, all the chaos that's happening to build something and just kind of having no ego, or it's I'm not above anything. I have to get involved at any level possible. Like you said, emptying the dishwasher, and then 5 minutes later, you walk over to your office and you're trying to close a chief scientific officer. That's cool. I kind of like that scrappiness.
And I think the part is you can get bogged down in the minutia, and I think that's where
being so disciplined about like what is going to be the highest and best use of my time today, and really making sure that, that is something that's going to be the priority for the day. And then just having, to your point, so many different companies and teams and folks that we want to make them feel like, and I hope, if they ever listen, like they do feel special and that they are like our only client or only company we're supporting. To me, at the end of the day, like, doesn't matter if someone's asking about like, how do I add my partner to benefits, or relocating someone from the UK to be our CTO of a company. Like all of that needs to be, attended to with the same attention, and making sure someone feel like their problem is like a very important problem, even if it might not be in kind of the whole grand scheme of what I'm working on. And that's something I learned in my first job in HR, like over 20 years ago. Like the head of HR told me basically that, and that really has stuck with me. And I think it really helps me be effective in a job when you're context switching all day long.
Do you think this is what HR is typically like at a VC, or is this more particular to the 459 initiative because you're providing support? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Every VC is going to do it differently. And so for folks that are interested, I mean, I think we're unique in the sense that, we kind of are these, Jack or Janes of all trades, and we are being able to kind of do a lot of different things for the small amount of companies that we support. I get to do a lot of HR advisory work too. I've talked about a lot of the tactical things, being that thought partner to the CEOs or executive teams on people issues, thinking about org planning, all these other things are also part of my job. And so to your point, it's just going to look different at every fund. For larger VCs, they have much bigger teams. And so the roles might be a bit more compartmentalized. You might have more of a swim lane of like, here's what you're doing. The smaller the team, it's definitely going to be, a broader role, which I've really appreciated, being able to be more than just, talent. It's definitely expanded to business operations for me in the last year.
Well, that's exciting. I've always loved the idea of being part of a startup. I've never actually been part of a startup besides my own business, but there's not as many layers, right? It's pretty lean. It's a lean business. So having all those moving parts, having all those quote unquote problems to solve, but then having that come to fruition and being able to build a company and then putting processes in place and putting resources in place to keep the cart moving forward is exciting. I've always been jealous of individuals like you that can be involved in that. And it sounds like really fun. It sounds stressful, but it sounds fun.
Yeah, I don't take it for granted. I mean, this is definitely the coolest job I've ever had. We get to see a lot of different teams. We get to build relations with them and see them go through all the different milestones from, maybe it's DC to maybe, moving into the clinic. Maybe it's the 50th employee. Like, so there's just so many different things that we get to celebrate. One of my favorite is when they come out of stealth, because I've actually got to do a lot on the website and kind of PR and branding. So we've had, Proceed Bio come out a couple of years ago, Renaissance Bio launched this summer. So it's kind of nice. And I know even more so for the folks in those companies, but you're working on this secret idea that's super sketchy and you're like, I'm at a company, but there's no website. I can't tell you anything about it. But so when they get to launch and there's, kind of a nice media coverage of those, and we get to actually tell the world like what these teams are working on, because we typically will launch the companies when there is, really something to tell. That's been super rewarding too. So there's a few more obviously to come, hopefully in the next, year or two that I can be talking about. But yeah, just being a part of these teams where their first early days, when it's just one person. And now we've got teams that are either 20, 50 folks.
That's great. What advice or maybe guidance would you give somebody who has spent their career in talent acquisition or HR, but they've worked at a portfolio company, right? They've worked at a company or they've worked at a large biotech or a large pharma. And, if they were to make that transition to the VC side, first off, do you think it's something everybody should try? Or do you think that it's only for certain people with a certain appetite for chaos and maybe, there's a higher level of or different level of performance that's required? But what advice would you give to somebody, to sum this up, who's maybe looking to make that transition, and what things should they consider?
Yeah, I think the appetite for chaos is a good way to put it. You have to be able to thrive in an environment where you're context switching all the time. The stakeholders in venture are, maybe it's your managing partner, maybe it's board members, executives. So
a lot of, I'd say, obviously important folks. And then you have, of course, all the, employees within the companies that are also important. So I think one, just being able to switch all day and talk to, again, maybe it's a partner, maybe it's a board member. So just having that, to your point, ability to just switch contexts all day long is important and be comfortable with chaos. I will say, like, venture is tough to break into, and I want to maybe try and demystify that a bit. I mean, there's only so many firms, there's only so many roles, especially if it's a smaller firm. I think obviously if it's a bigger organization, there'll be more opportunities. So that's maybe an easier way to start and kind of enter into, a firm that's a lot larger and has, maybe more, capital under management. If you're looking for a role like mine, it's N of one, and, that can be lonely sometimes. So if you're okay with that, or you're maybe not okay and love being part of a bigger HR team. So those are some things to think about. But I think in general, it's tough because there's limited roles, even less so than biotechs these days. And there's, not a lot of HR talent roles within biotechs in this environment. But I would say be ruthless about networking. I've actually seen some folks due to networking, building connections, and again, talent people were naturally great at that. Checking in, and having coffee or asking what someone's working on or sharing something that you're working on and trying to build those relations with folks within a venture firm are great ways, because once, if an opportunity arises, that's how you're going to be able to, probably get that role. So I think those are things, just tips on how to even break into it. The way I ended up here was from a relationship I had with one of the partners here who I work directly with. But I will say what led me here is I had reached out to her asking her, just could she help me think through career development? And this is several years ago. And she responded back. But what led very quickly, like I'd say days or weeks, is an offer to join the firm. And because, again, I had just checked in with her to see what she thought. And, we didn't have a role for HR here yet. And so that's what I mean by just, you never know, and unfortunately, I don't think a lot of VCs do advertise their positions. It is a lot through the network. So I think just continue to check in, build relations, be thoughtful about, your reach outs. Those are ways that you can break into it. But yeah, being comfortable with chaos is definitely part of the job and important.
That's great advice. And it is interesting, the thing that you said that resonates with me, which is really a huge part of my career and in my life, is just the networking piece, right? Just be talking to people, just be asking questions, just be proactively developing relationships. Even if those relationships never come to any sort of fruition, they're meaningful. Like, you can have really good relationships with people in the industry and they can share a lot of really nice information with you, and you have no idea where it's going to lead you. So keeping that networking muscle alive led you to where you are today. So that's a really good piece of advice.
Yeah, I appreciate that about you, Chris. So, I mean, we've known each other for a while, but anytime I've reached out, you've always been so responsive, so helpful, making introductions, you've been giving your perspective. And I think that's just a great, way to get to know someone, before you even do business, before you even think you want to maybe be joining that firm. So again, to your point, just the art of networking and doing it with intention and thoughtfulness and just being authentic can really yield, I think, great results, when you do it.
Totally.
And great to connect today.
Absolutely. Great connecting, Kori. We appreciate it. And thank you so much for being a guest.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening to Talent Therapy with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes and is copywritten by Ronan Vance, LLC.